welcome to the meeting. First, I would like to thank you, Professor Casal, for accepting the invitation to participate in this symposium. We are very glad to have you with us. Now, a short presentation. Paula Casal is research professor in law department at Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Her research interests are focused in distributive justice, and she has written from biologically informed perspective about gender, non-human animals, personhood, and the distinction between natural and social inequality. She has also written about more specific issues, such as how to distribute the costs of child rearing, the right to sea access for landlocked states, the moral limits on religious and cultural accommodation, xenotransplantation and no-identity problem, and the distinction medical ethicists drawn between therapy and enhancement. Her work has appeared in journals such as Ethics, Economics and Philosophy, Journal of Medical Ethics, Journal of Moral Philosophy, Journal of Political Philosophy and Political Studies. She is an associate editor of Politics, Philosophy and Economics, president of the Great Ape Project Spain, and board member of Academics Stand Against Poverty. Professor Casal, you have the floor.
Okay. I'm going to share the screen. First thing I have to say is that my main employer is not Pompeu Fabra, but ICREA, because otherwise I'd be told off for failing to know that. And now I'm just going to share my presentation. So thank you so much for inviting me to this terrific and extremely well-organized mega conference. I am going to talk about a paper that I am developing right now, which draws on previous work, but is going to be focused mainly on Rawls and publicity. And so since I have never given this talk before, I hope that I will do well with the timing. If not, please interrupt me or warn me. Okay, this is the general plan. So I will explain the incentive problems and the roles and defense, then focus on the basic structure defense of the roles and positional incentives, and see how it, I think it has been definitely defeated by Jerry Cohen, but it has revived under the publicity restriction defended by Andrew Williams, which has a longer life. I think it will have a longer life than the predecessor. And then I explain how egalitarians can still survive this second line of defense of the roles and meet the publicity restriction. But this has some surprising conclusions. One is that we can make the egalitarian ethos, or some versions of it, adjust to the requirements of roles and publicity. And one of the surprising for me consequences is that then the Rawlsians could really move in this direction, and they will have a much stronger position, which would be really difficult to criticize. So that would make their view in the end more plausible, but this would be as a result of the partial failure of their attempts to defend the initial position. Okay, so I'm going to try to do without Rawlses or sort of jargon. So let's imagine that we work in this company. We're making chairs, and we pay ourselves per hour, and so we work more or less the same hours. We make more or less the same money a month, and as an experiment, we switch to payment by the piece. So the furniture we make will determine our salary. So now we're doing much better. Our company is prospering, and we are earning more than we were earning before. But of course, now we have different salaries. Now, the roles and position is Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Initially, it wouldn't have been wrong if some people wanted to work fewer hours than others and get paid a little bit less. We have to respect people's freedom. And now people also have the possibility of sort of working harder and earning more, or producing less. Of course, some of the reasons for the differences would be innate talent. So that is what, for egalitarians like Jerry Cohen, makes this very problematic, apart from the fact that in effect there will be greater inequalities. But now he thinks that there is a solution, which is that part of the inequality that we are now experiencing is not really necessary for the gains in productivity. So if we had an ethos of working hard, or just as hard, or working for others, we would be able to produce so many chairs or other things that we might be producing without requiring such large economic incentives. But the Rawlsians contest this view. So this has various versions. The most famous one is by Jerry Cohen, Moby Carens, who maybe started earlier, Martin Wilkinson, Michael Titelman. So there's been several people who have defended some version of this idea that not all the inequality is necessary for the efficiency gains. And we could have an ethos that allow compensation for some jobs being particularly hard or stressful, for example, and also allow individuals to be selfish to a reasonable extent. And also it would allow to motivate activity that cannot otherwise be someone at will. But otherwise, on this view, we should not have any more inequalities. Now, the two main objections that the Rawlsians have presented are the sort of the liberty objection and the basic structure objection. I am not going to talk about the liberty objection, which says that this ethos is actually prohibited by justice because it goes against the priority of liberty. And so I have this quote in blue: the priority of liberty means that we cannot be forced to engage in work that is highly productive in terms of material goods. What kind of work people do and how hard they do it is up to them to decide in light of the various incentives society offers. I'm going to leave this objection and focus on the other one, although my conclusion would be that this is where we're going to turn to this eventually, is inescapable. Well, the other one is an attempt to, in a way, circumvent the discussion of whether it is morally required to make this effort for the worst off. So the Rawlsians focus on the fact that the principles of justice apply to the basic structure because its effects are so profound and influential and present from the start. And so they think that simply the ethos is not required by justice. So if this worked, then we wouldn't have to discuss really whether incentives are just or unjust. We will simply say, well, it just doesn't apply. Our theory is focused on the basic structure, and maybe you're right. Maybe it would be better for the worse off if we adopted this ethos, but our theory is focused on something else. Now, we move into how this second line of defense fails. Then this is the example that I think completely destroys the basic structure defense of the Rawlsian position, is to say that a sexist ethos would be profoundly influential and certainly present from the start, and it would be arbitrary and implausible to restrict the egalitarian principles or all the principles of justice only to the legal basic structure. If the criteria is the profound influence, there could be an ethos that is just as influential or more than a law. So that puts the Rawlsians into a position where they have to choose in legalistic conception of the basic structure, which is implausible, or they go for a more plausible, more expansive view of what the basic structure is about, which is toothless against the ethos, because if it includes a sexist ethos, it could include a gender egalitarian ethos or a social egalitarian ethos, or something like what the critics of Rawls are proposing. And I think this is final. There's no response to that. I think Cohen here has won. But now Andrew Williams has tried to revive this view that the ethos is not required because the justice is about the basic structure by redefining it. So on his view, the basic structure is not a legal system, but is a system of public rules rather than legal rules. So public rules include legal rules, of course, but it doesn't include anything. So it doesn't, and in his view, it doesn't include this particular ethos. So he says we should favor conceptions whose scope is restricted to publicly accessible phenomena because justice must be seen in order to be done. Right. So he appeals to the Rawlsian view of publicity, but in a very specific way. So we know that Rawls has spoken about publicity in many different places, that he distinguishes these three levels, which are not the same. And very briefly, there's the general idea that we should have rules that could have resulted from some kind of agreement. No? So we shouldn't have something like government house utilitarianism deciding something like a survival lottery. And so suddenly there's a massive sacrifice that is required of us, like we have to give up our organs because we got this lottery, and suddenly there's an enormous sacrifice we weren't counting on. We should know what we're getting into. We should know about the rules of society, and it should be possible that we agree to them from the start. Then there's the second level, which is about shared methods of inquiry. So we should have methods like those of science, that different people can access the same information from different positions, rather than rely on a special access to God or tarot cards or other methods that cannot be shared. And we should also respect this duty of civility, where we don't appeal to God's will or something that we cannot communicate to people with a different view on the importance of those reasons, no? Like religious reasons. And finally, the justification of the rules have to be public, or at least publicly available. So if you want to find out, you would be able to find out. Now, Williams' three rules of publicity are derived from Rawls. They are Rawlsian in many ways, but not the same. No, so he wants to say that the rules have to include knowledge of their general applicability, the particular requirements. So what is required of us? What is expected? Are we going to have to donate a kidney, or are we going to have to give up our vocation, or what is required of us? And we also should know whether other people are doing their part. So that if we are agree on blood donation, organ donation, or something, we want to know if this is going on and is accepted. We have some default system where, unless you say otherwise, you are agreeing to donation. So we need to know whether this is happening, or we are we have been called to make a sacrifice, and we don't really know if we are the first ones that are going to deliver. Right. So I see that the publicity defense has more promise than the basic structure defense, but it is full of problems. So some of the critiques of Williams are related to aspects of the egalitarian ethos that makes it more plausible. And I think that's a general problem with in ethics. No, so if you want to have very clear and very simple rules, don't kill, don't lie, yes, but of course this is not plausible. You have to qualify when, in which cases, and so on. And so of course it's going to become more and more complicated. the idea that we don't have to be 100% impartial, so that we can be partial to ourselves and our children, for example, to some extent, creates this problem generally in ethics. No, so think of the first formulation of the agent-centered prerogative of Scheffler. No, you can take your self-interest and you multiply by a factor of n. No, well, then you see somebody and you think, oh, he's bad, but no, maybe he's not bad. He's just, exercising his personal prerogative. So, of course, any departure from 100% impartiality is going to make whatever ethical norm you propose more plausible, but also less clear where it starts and how when it applies and so on. The correction for labor burdens is the same. No, of course, if a job is very stressful or is very hard, well, there should be some compensation for it. But because it's difficult to calculate all this, we are going to have more plausibility, but at the cost of less clarity, because it'll be harder to know. Oh, he gets paid a lot. Oh, yeah, but it's a compensation. So it wouldn't be so clear to know who is being overpaid, for example. Then the problem with clarity is especially serious for Williams, because he is demanding enormous clarity. So he should tell us exactly what is the importance of publicity, if it's a necessary condition, if it's something that would be desirable, it would be nice to have, like the icing on the cake, or what is exactly the force of this requirement. The roles and roles have to satisfy publicity. What does this mean? Think of the example of drunk driving or speeding. Now we have this amazing technology that allows us to know exactly how fast was somebody going and for how many kilometers, and we can test the alcohol in blood and know when this person drank, how much, and so on. But so what does this mean? So now this is public, it's all accessible, it's great. So maybe it means that we can find these people with more confidence because we are completely sure about what they've done. But before we had all this technology, it was already wrong to be speeding or to be driving after having consumed alcohol. So maybe in the past, before we had this technology, it was even more necessary to have an ethos against those practices, even though it was quite easy to get away and we didn't know how many people were speeding or how many people were drinking and so on. So one problem for Williams is that he's demanding clarity, but he's not giving us enough clarity about what turns on a failure to satisfy his publicity requirement. And that is one difference with Rawls's 3 levels of publicity, because Rawls's 3 levels are plausible and they are feasible. He could say you must meet these 3 criteria, and it is no problem with insisting on that. But it is not clear that we can meet Williams' criteria all the time. Sometimes it's just impossible to know what people are doing, and we don't have that transparency. That level of clarity is just impossible to attain, and we don't know what happens exactly when we don't meet the Rawlsian publicity criteria. So the case that he discussed is again the case of a sexist family. And I think the sort of defense based on publicity not only sort of fails generally, but I think it particularly fails in the case under discussion. So, for example, Williams claims that a gender egalitarian ethos is public. Of course, nobody wants to go against this example. And he doesn't formulate it. But let's assume that we should have equal housework for couples with equal jobs, or equal opportunities for sons and daughters. If comparing differential labor burdens in the case of 2 workers in the chair-making company, for example, is not possible, it is even going to be more difficult to compare the husband and the wife and think, oh, he has this job, is maybe physically more tiring or is more stressful, and whatever is the other one. So if we cannot compare different jobs to calculate the additional pay that they should receive in compensation for some unpleasant or difficult aspects of their job, we are not going to be able to make that comparison in order to calculate exactly what the husband and the wife should do. And there are other complications in their case, which is, for example, there's no agreement on what is the job that needs to be done. No? So men and women, sometimes they don't agree what is the meaning of sufficiently clean or appropriate clothing or nutritious meals. And when somebody says, oh, it's my turn, but I'm exhausted, how do you know that this is completely true or a bit of an exaggeration, and so on? So you are never going to have this level of publicity that Williams is expecting to find in the gender egalitarian ethos, which he seems to think, oh, well, 50-50 is all very simple, very clear. It needs publicity. It does not. He also thinks that the victims of injustice will be able to know that they're being exploited, but we know that this is very often part of the problem, that the women that are the victims, they themselves are brought up in a certain way that they are not aware of the extent of their oppression, and that is part of the problem. The same happens with underreporting. No? I supervised a thesis on gender in Nepal, for example, and in the worst years for women in Nepal, the official figures for rape in the country were zero, as if nobody was raped in Nepal. Of course it was. It was a sign of how terrible were the situation of women that it was so unreported, because reporting it could make your life a lot worse. No? So we don't know what is happening. There's a lot of underreporting. And then, as we now know, there's a lot of inequality is created not by major injustices, by the accumulation of countless microaggressions. No? Small things that is very difficult to see. Sometimes it's difficult for the men to see what they are doing. It's difficult for them to see them in other men. And it's very difficult to legislate or to have simple rules. No, I just read an article in El País about how the fact that men tend to read men. They tend not to read books written by women. You know, they done some statistics and they find, well, you can't have a rule saying that, you know, you should read her because she's a woman. No, so if we don't have an ethos with a good faith effort and no knowledge of the situation, then, you know, we cannot really have anything similar to gender equality. And that is, I think, you know, what makes me think that there's something wrong with this publicity requirement, that justice requires good faith efforts. It doesn't require omniscience. We don't have to know everything, but that is not an argument for not promoting a certain ethos. With, I don't know why it's not moving. Sorry. Oh, okay. There are two final problems with the view. Is that if we insist that compliance matters because it's the compliance itself that is important, then if abuse is rife, that would weaken the case for norms that prohibit it, and that seems very implausible. Then if we say that compliance is not what matters, but is the possibility of acquiring knowledge of compliance, so that to know what is going on, then the mere fact that we cannot know, for example, so many problems of abuse of women, there's this problem that it happens behind closed doors, and we don't really know what happens in many of the cases. That would be very strange if that weakened the case for deeming it unjust. So all of these examples make me think that this doesn't have much hope. Although, you know, I still agree that there is a difference between making rules assuming full compliance and making rules assuming that there's going to be very imperfect compliance. So compliance matters, but it cannot matter in this particular way because I just find these counterexamples too powerful. And the main thing is that actually the egalitarians can come up with rules which do satisfy publicity, and it's not that difficult to invent them. No, I've invented these two, for example. Do not engage in industrial action to increase your salary if you already are in the top half of the income distribution. So if you are making more money than most people in your society, you cannot go on a strike and demand more salary for yourself. That would be very easy to check whether people who are in the richest half are going on a strike or not. It would be very easy to check compliance. It would be a simple rule that meets the Williams criteria. Or you could support an affordable reduction in the work week that can reduce high unemployment. Or you could make it for periods of recession or something. So then in a recession, you have to agree to reduce your work week, as it happens in some companies where people agree to a voluntary reduction of the work week so that some people in their company wouldn't be fired. And there's other proposals like Van den Broeke proposed this: do not threaten to move your company abroad whenever tax reforms are announced. So if you're told that there's going to be more egalitarian income taxation, do not say, well, if you do that, I am going to move the company abroad, so therefore you must maintain more unequal levels of taxation, because if you lose my company going away and maybe dragging some other companies, you will do worse and it will be worse for everyone. So these kind of arguments that some of the big companies employ with threats to move elsewhere couldn't be employed. And of course, the government would have to hear the threat, so it would have to be public, at least known to the government that they are making these threats. So that would also be satisfy the publicity requirement. And do not be asked to be paid more than the women or Black people or any other salient minorities in the company. So Joshua Cohen, for example, said that Rawls would clearly have to agree to that. And so that maybe Rawls would agree to a lot of egalitarian rules that meet publicity, and we are assuming that he wouldn't. But if he's correct that we can interpret the basic structure in terms of a system of public rules, maybe Rawls would agree to include in the basic structure some rules. For example, we normally have some rules against going on strike for special professions like emergency health workers or doctors or firemen, police, and so on. So there's special rules applying to them. We could extend that and say, well, if you're in the richest half, you don't go on strike, and that could be a law or just could be a public rule that we know about and we talk about, and people would be embarrassed not to go on strike in that case. And in fact, there is a rule that, according to Josh Cohen, Rawls would also accept. And this rule doesn't even meet the publicity requirements. So Rawls would reject the idea of going to job interviews and bluffing and saying that you don't really want that job, that it would be very costly for you to move to that place, or you're very happy where you are, blah, blah, blah. And so in order to maximize your income by deceiving your employer about your true situation and your true motives. Of course, it is in the nature of deception that we don't know if the people are telling the truth. Even nowadays, we don't know after interviews whether the candidates we interview told us the truth about how keen they were to do this, or whether they didn't care about it, and so on. So this would be a norm that the Rawlsians would be against, and it wouldn't meet the publicity requirements. So the other norms that do meet the publicity requirements, why not? Why couldn't the Rawlsians accept? So the conclusion is that the publicity considerations, which maybe are irrelevant for certain roles, where they are plausible criteria and they're not very demanding. For example, do not litter at sea. No, it's not very difficult to comply, and it's a plausible role. So maybe in those cases, it's not so important. But in other cases where it's more controversial and the requirements are quite big, like you must work harder without earning any more, or you must change profession and not follow your vocation but do something else which is more socially useful, then because that isn't like as obvious as do not litter at sea, might make it more important for the publicity requirements to be met. No? And in fact, all of these rules that we saw were both public, and they didn't seem like extremely burdensome. While they, so some of the formulations of Cohen's egalitarian ethos, which is to live by the difference principle all the time in your own life, do not do anything that is not maximally beneficial to the least advantage, that could be very demanding. But these rules about not going on a strike if you're in the top half of the income distribution and so on, they do not seem so burdensome, and they do meet publicity. So why couldn't the Rawlsians accept those criteria if Williams is right that the key to the basic structure objection is nothing to do with the law, it is all to do with publicity. And in fact, I think if the Rawlsians took this position, then their view would be quite difficult to criticize, because they will be able to say what they were able to say before, no, that this is all thought for a society that has reached some level of economic development. We're going to have a social minimum. We are going to have the difference principle in place. So we can assume that people have enough, and they also have opportunities to have more than enough if they want to attain it themselves. So maybe it is too burdensome to ask other people to work more for those who have enough. And that position, if you find it unconvincing or too sort of conservative, then could be modified by the adoption of all these egalitarian rules that meet publicity requirements. And then, so the theory would have moved so much closer to the Rawlsian position than they would be separated just by the other part of the egalitarian ethos, which cannot be transformed into a rule that is public and sort of clear and easy to see if people are doing it or not. So the gap will be much smaller. The Rawlsian position would have moved closer to Cohen, and therefore it would be a lot harder to criticize. And I stop here, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Casal, for your very interesting lecture. We are now open to debate. You can raise your questions, writing down on chat, or you can just raise hands and ask in the microphone.
Do I stop sharing?
No.
No. Okay.
Yes, it's okay now.
Thank you, Professor Casal, for a very interesting talk. I was thinking here that the argument is very indeed strong when we look at a kind of literature that has come, for example, this article from Gerald Rawls, that Political and Distributive Justice, where he argues that it's really not possible once we have overlapping consensus to commits to egalitarian principles. So I was just wondering, in this framework that you built regarding a justification, this issue when they say that overlap, now when we think of overlapping consensus, so if it doesn't leave a political justice to non-egalitarians like issues, so it's a strong argument, I would say, to imagine there's still egalitarian ethics even within overlapping consensus. I would just want to hear you a little bit on this conceptual structure also that Rawls built afterwards.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know this paper by Jerry Gauss you're referring to. So he's saying that you could not have the egalitarian ethos because there would be too much disagreement about it. It would be something.
They say
like
they argue that overlapping consensus. Yeah, they put a dilemma for Rawlsians because either you have to stick to overlapping consensus or you would have to shy back from this structure to actually develop an egalitarian ethics. So I was really interested in what you have to say about this structure and justifiability.
But would that, I know some people thought that sort of Jerry Coyne had, after all, some religious streak, and that there was something religion-like about the egalitarian ethos, and that not everybody was persuaded. Some people had faith in it, and so they made it so similar to our religion that it was incompatible with a Rawlsian position. But what about all the reformulations of the ethos that we can come up with? They don't seem to be religious. So the idea that, for example, you should have some restrictions on going on strike to demand higher wages. Why is that? It's not, doesn't seem that different to the restrictions on industrial action that we already have, or a prohibition on threatening whenever the government is saying, oh, we're just trying to get out of a crisis, we have a lot of social problems, let's sort of regulate taxes so that we reduce poverty in our country, and then some companies start threatening, oh, we're going to move to another country. Why couldn't you have a prohibition like that consistent with the overlapping consensus? I think if you do make the egalitarian ethos look more like a religion, then that claim is plausible. But if you say, okay, forget about the egalitarian ethos and some quotations from Coyne, and let's think about specific rules that are designed to meet the publicity requirements. There are public, simple rules like those. Then I don't see that they are like a religion, or that they could not be consistent with the Rawlsian framework, because they are public rules.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I was just trying to actually even see other arguments that could. Thank you so much.
We have a question on the chat from Professor Nitamar de Oliveira. Thank you, Professor Casal. So, do you think the publicity condition is satisfied in a Rawlsian egalitarianism that avoids Cohen's fact insensitivity thesis?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
I will repeat. Do you think the publicity condition is satisfied in a Rawlsian egalitarianism that avoids Cohen's fact insensitivity thesis?
So you want to go in that direction of the? I think this third part of Cohen's book is the worst and the least necessary, and I'm trying to move exactly in the opposite direction. So accommodate the Rawlsians more, maintain the social goal of having more equality, but try to work within the roles and constraints of publicity, rather than going to this line of questioning constructivism, questioning whether justice is something different to the considerations that we made about efficiency, increases in productivity, and so on. So in the end, I'm not really sure how I would answer, but what I'm sure is that that is not the direction one should go into. We should go in the other direction, so try to talk to the Rawlsians rather than depart more radically from their entire project.
Thank you again. We have some time, more time for questions.
And anyway, don't call me a professor. I never allow anyone to call me anything like that.
No.
So when I had this student from Nepal, he told me that he had, a difficult childhood, remembering these 6 levels of politeness. That in caste society you have these 6 levels, and you have to remember how to phrase. How you address one person because of the caste and the other one, and you be told off a lot as a child because you get it wrong. So in the end, I said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I call everyone by the highest thing, like everyone is Royal Highness, or whatever is the equivalent of the greatest. And I have been calling everybody too for like 20 years or so, and everybody on first names. And I think you should earn your respect with hard work rather than with subtitles. No?
Okay. So I have a question on my own about if I understood well your lecture. You think that equality can be related with a kind of ethos, but how can we think this ethos? How it can start by institutions? Because I think this is to kind of, we think about this by culture or by institutions putting a kind of incentive in creating this kind of ethos. It's like creating a kind of virtual circle. I don't know, how do you think this starting point?
Okay, well, maybe that is another way in which the Rawlsians would share the goal and have a preference for an institutional approach. But I think we need to have both, because having the rules without a certain attitude, sometimes it can be worse, as in the work the rules strike, where people say, I'm going to follow the rules strictly, and it's a disaster, because if people don't have the intention to make the extra effort or to interpret things correctly and so on, things are not going to work. So you probably need both. But most times where you have a rule, it tends to have this effect of changing people's ethos. Like you have a law against sexual harassment, and then people don't think it's funny anymore. So then people change their attitude towards it. Or if you have, in some places, rules of a woman speaks, a man speaks, and that is part of the institutional setup, then when you don't impose it anymore, people are already finding it strange if only men talk and no women has been asked for a while. So both, I would say both, and it would be impossible to predict for all kinds of situations what would be more effective. But if you can, if you combine them, that is the best solution.
Thank you.
Just a comment, because I think that one main obstacle, maybe at least in Brazil or other societies, that like meritocracy has become an ideology in all classes, and the self-made person and all that. Sometimes it's really hard to, when we talk about an egalitarian ethos, without thinking about how this political culture could cultivate this ethos and educate people in this ethos. Or because, I mean, I think like others like me here as a teacher, and it's very common for us to talk about egalitarianism, and it's something for other people, because it's amazing, like, how convinced people, I mean, our society right now is by these ideological issues that just make it each time harder to for justification, I think. So just a comment, but I'm all for any paths that we can open in this situation, and also thinking geographically. I know that Spain, I don't know if this is true because I don't have this experience, but from reading, you have a very an ethos of solidarity, which is great, and it's really, we have to think what works out in some countries that we can think as important and possible for other places as well.
Okay, with meritocracy, do you think the problem is the idea, or that people mistake as merit and something else? Because the people who are doing very well in society tend to be the children of these people who were already occupying the dominant positions in society. So it is true that maybe they do get a master and they study in a good university, but many of these merits it's something that they were able to acquire as a result of the background inequalities in which they grew. So when you have a background of extreme inequality like Brazil, then any claim that you make to merit is going to be immediately something that might even make you laugh, because yes, merit relative to enormous privilege that allowed you to acquire these merits. So maybe if people were in fact more meritocratic and took into account the enormous inequalities that they depart from, then they wouldn't justify so much inequality. So maybe, I don't know, what do you think? I think maybe people think that they're being meritocratic, but they're not really understanding the merit correctly.
Yeah, but I agree, but unfortunately, most countries that are very unequal, this sensibility to I'm relying here on some studies. I forgot the name of that French author. He wrote something about the Paixões Tristes. If my friends that read this book also remember me the name, but basically it's shown that in very unequal countries, the sensibility to inequality isn't as big as in other countries where the gap is smaller. So it's an issue, I think, for us to think about. When you live in a very unequal country, the sensibility and to that kind of injustice is not as big as in other countries which have more inegalitarianism, but less, how can I say, not sensibility, but the people aren't aware. If you ask the population, they don't think that it's that unequal. So, I mean, it's just another part of the problem that is really interesting to think about.
So people are exposed to extreme inequality so regularly that eventually they become desensitized to it, no? Like as in places where you see a lot of homelessness and you see them all the time, eventually people just think of them as part of the landscape, and they don't take the vision of a homeless person as like, I am confronted with an enormous injustice here that we should be trying to remedy straight away, no? It's the frequency with which you see great inequality that makes you less sensitive, no? Yeah. I have seen many times, like for 3 years, I used to go and take medicines in West Africa. And I was always amazed by the level of acceptance of extreme poverty that some people express. I many times wonder why are they stealing from me everything I have, or why are they so sort of happy and content in their situation? Because you often see people in Spain with much smaller inequalities than you saw there, and they are looking over their shoulder all the time, you know, that somebody has a somewhat better car or flat or something, while in Africa you can witness enormous inequality and poverty and still don't see that sense of anger at the situation. So maybe you're right, it just it goes together, no? The greater the inequality, the greater the acceptance.
We have one more question in the chat. Yuzi asks, in this case, there is also the fact that very deep inequalities often lead a large part of the population to take refuge in religion, and many religions preach a submission and acceptance of reality as God's will. It's a comment, not really a question. I don't know if you would like to make a comment about this.
Oof, it's just like a broad topic. So the comment is that sorry, I didn't read the question exactly, but was this person blaming religions for preaching acceptance of inequality and submission, and the idea that in heaven the poor will be rich and so on? So was it?
May I talk?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, you can talk.
I was thinking about what Julia was saying, that sometimes in countries that we have so big, so deep inequalities, that sometimes people is not really, it's not that they are not aware about, but they are not really sometimes talking about or fighting against. And sometimes we see that maybe it is also related to this religion question, or it's not a question, but a fact that many religions are, I think that they are helping. They are really helping. But it was a comment thinking about what Julia was saying, that in some countries there is a deep, very deep inequalities, and we sometimes in the others that the inequality is not so deep, we can see more people fighting against. And then I thought about a religion, that sometimes religion is it's a good way to help, but sometimes also it's a way to accept reality. And it's common to see also this link between religion and very poor realities, and also submission or acceptance, and not really political movements to change reality. It was only a thought about.
Also, it's just an empirical observation. And also in very poor countries with enormous inequality, you do find greater religiosity than in more developed, no, except maybe the United States, no. But I'm thinking about about Europe. But from a Rawlsian point of view, you can fight the inegalitarian part of the message, no? with your argument, with your rules, with your institutional reform, but you cannot go into the fuller criticism of the whether these are just ideologies made there to maintain inequality and to oppress the poor, no? Because that would be stepping outside, no? The area that is appropriate, no? You can use taxation certainly, and maybe you can use these public rules that create greater equality, but that falls short of launching into a general rejection of all of the religious creeds as sort of ideologies made to manipulate the poor.
Thank you. We still have some time.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question, not a question, but if I know that it's evening there also, Paula, so I'll try to make it short, but it's something that I've been thinking about, especially I started thinking about this on your article, on your paper on sufficiency that you published in Ethics, when you argue about the idea of respect and equality, and how this concept of respect sometimes can be, I want to be, I want to try to make your argument in a way, but how, if you only use this term respect, it can also be a venue for unegalitarian claims. So, and I was thinking also, when we are thinking of an egalitarian ethos, it's important to exactly focus on this, because I also see that respect has become like a main, like a word that can mean almost, can go either way. So, and also, I was remembering another article that I read by Martha Nussbaum, and she says that Rawls, even though he's always talking about respect, in many times he will qualify how is this respect being supposed to happen, like in an ideal society and all that. So just if you can clarify for me your thoughts on this idea, if you think that respect is like a nowadays, or if I just on that paper, but I think it applies to this idea of us putting like egalitarian as a key issue in contemporary societies.
Well, respect, like dignity, it gets used differently by different authors, and it's one of these words that is, quite difficult to grasp. But there, in that paper, I was resisting Frankfurt's idea that you don't need equality at all, because anything you want to say about sexism or racism, discrimination, and so on, you can already say it by using the notion of respect. And I was skeptical that you could say those things. No, he doesn't explain a lot of cases which seem unfair, of sort of discrimination against women, for example, just simply by saying that you're not respecting them. Or sometimes he tries to say that discrimination is about something being completely arbitrary, and that is true in some cases, like the color of the skin is completely arbitrary because it's not going to correlate to anything. But there are other cases of disability or gender-specific cases like pregnancy, where it's not simply a matter of arbitrariness. What matters is that if you do not accommodate the fact that some workers get pregnant, then you are going to end up with an inequality in society because of that. So it's not just that not everything follows the model of sort of irrelevant black skin, and not everything can be sorted by merely appealing to respect. I think there are some of the greatest social problems. The normal way to understand them is in terms of equality. But of course, this was a discussion of Frankfurt. So Rawls talking about equal respect and concern, or other people like Peter Singer talking about equal respect would have a different meaning. Yeah. Am I supposed to be reading the chat? Because I haven't been.
No, I can read the questions on the chat.
Okay.
We're still open to questions.
Well, can I ask you some questions?
Yeah. Yes, sure.
So, what's your reaction to this idea that rules should be public? That we should know first what it requires from us, and if possible, know something about general levels of compliance.
We can put this question.
People are so divided. Some people think, like Cohen, no, publicity just doesn't matter at all. It's completely irrelevant. And I used to have that position that it was really not important at all. And now I am thinking, well, if I am required to make a big sacrifice, maybe it does make some difference. And also this general idea that the assumption, so we're gonna think of some rules, and if we think that people are gonna follow those rules and that we know that people are following these rules, then we might come up with different rules than if we are already assuming something different, that hardly anyone is gonna follow that rule. So compliance, that's the difference between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. So compliance, assumed expected compliance, makes a difference to our proposing certain rules. So what's your reaction to this? Do you think it makes no difference, or do you think maybe?
Well, you're talking about compliance as in a juridical sense for companies and business ethics compliance,
or individuals,
or individually as well, right?
Yeah.
For the ethos, right? For the public ethos, that's.
Yeah. For example, in the case of littering in the sea, I think even if I don't have any idea what people are doing, I should never throw plastic in the sea, regardless, even if I had no idea. But there are other cases where it just seems relevant to even to the construction of rules, to imagine that there's going to be some level of compliance and that we're going to know about that level of compliance.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, but in a country like Brazil, compliance seems to be almost a new word for Brazilian common sense vocabulary. And it only emerged as a word to be used by Brazilians because of some big schemes by huge construction companies, Odebrecht, and especially Petrobras, which is a big oil company. They had so many scandals and so many schemes that for the first time, we saw the word compliance being used just like that in English by Brazilians. Some people don't even know what compliance is all about. But in the way you're describing with this very good example of, not polluting the ocean, for instance, which is a typical problem for most Brazilians. A place like Santa Catarina is a beautiful island with 42 beaches, of which very few are unpolluted. And most local people do not even know or even care about this. It's the same thing down here in Rio Grande, or Rio de Janeiro is even worse. They only cleaned the Guanabara Bay for the Olympic Games. Now everyone goes back to normal and you can keep polluting Guanabara Bay. It's typical of Brazilians. They don't care much about the environment. And unless you have, this kind of huge, let's say, collective awareness on the level of a public ethos, perhaps it won't have any effect, because people do not think of compliance in this sense. They would think that compliance is something for big companies to comply with regulations, including environmental, protection and stuff like that. They think it's more like a business ethics item. They are not used to thinking of compliance in everyday, daily basis, relationship to others or to the environment. At least that's the way I see it as a Brazilian. I'll be very critical of our own democratic ethos.
Well, the case of developing countries where there is low level of compliance with certain things is a good example of a problem for the roles and positions that insist too much on either compliance or knowledge of compliance. I think the rule, again, for protecting the environment should be invariant on that. But it's not just Brazil. In many developing countries, you find people that maybe they think, my life is too uncomfortable. On top of that, you ask me to make this extra effort, but really, the effort of not littering is such a small one that it should really be completely invariant on levels of compliance. No? And sometimes the worse the compliance, the more it is necessary to promote that ethos. No? So it could never, I am concerned with that. Low compliance could never be an argument against an ethos that is really necessary.
Yeah, I would return the question to you. I'm very grateful that you raised this question, because what would you make of something like micropolitics? Some people here think that if each individual or some collectives, like environmental activists and people who are really caring about the environment, if they start doing the work in small groups, maybe it's going to have some impact in society. Because, when you think of the big politics, it simply doesn't happen. Just to give you an example, Workers' Party, leftist, governments of Lula and Dilma, they didn't do very much for the environment in terms of, of all the demands. So there are not too many politicians who are really taking the environment as part of their programmatic issues. But I think on the level of an individual and some small collectives, then you see lots of environmental activism, people who are really fighting for, the preservation of the environment. So do you think it's possible to have some hope for, change, for social change by starting on micro level of activism?
I am thinking that, of course, the roles and assumption is the opposite. Right. Is that, for example, if you have to deal with homeless people by yourself,
right?
It would be quite costly. For several months we had this man downstairs that we were taking dinners to and everything, and it really was quite a lot of work to help one person by yourself. So they think, relative to the sacrifice and the effort that you have to make, the institutional approach is always better. You just agree to this tax and the government will create somewhere for all of the homeless to go and they will deal with it. So in relation to the effort and the sacrifice, it is so much more effective when you do it institutionally. But you're saying, no, in some places, institutionally is hopeless. The only hope is when you start with a small scale, like micropolitics, as you call them. That is what is going to be more effective relative to the effort you put in. So then the same argument about efficiency that the Rawlsians typically employ in favor of institutional reforms rather than starting with the individual. If that is the case, if there is greater efficacy on the part of some small groups, then the argument would go in their direction. And some people do make these claims even with NGOs, that sometimes smaller ones have smaller costs of bureaucracy and so on, and you give them some funds and they use them more effectively. So the argument for efficiency is only circumstantially connected to the institutional approach, because we are assuming that the institutional approach to, say, homelessness and so on turns the same effort into a greater outcome. But in other cases, that might not be the case. So the argument would go in the other direction. Yeah.
Paula, we have time for some final remarks. If you want to emphasize some point of your lecture or return, you feel free.
Okay. So I was listening to Rainer saying that Rawls has been identified with the liberals, but actually he wanted to vindicate that he was much more left-wing than people assume, and was not committed to capitalism as people assume, and so on. And I used to have a much more critical view of Rawls regarding incentives before, but now, I think, well, if they really are assuming that the level of development will be sufficiently high that people would have enough, that people would have opportunities to get more than enough, and in addition, they were going to adopt a number of egalitarian rules that are public, then their position really is not, couldn't be described as conservative, even regarding incentives, no? Because you could keep on accumulating public rules like the ones that accumulated, so eventually they will all amount to such egalitarianism that you wouldn't be in effect very far from the coin position. So I have also, like Rainer, have a sort of kinder view of the Rawlsian position now.
Well, thank you very much again for your lecture. It was very, very nice to have you here. I'd like to share with another colleagues, Julia, Nitamar, if you want to say something.
I'd also like to thank you for being here with us tonight, and say that regarding this political time that we are living, and even how a theorist as Rawls is also being reinterpreted, has been reinterpreted in decades, but now we have we can see libertarian arguments, rereadings of which, okay, each one does research on based on its foundations, but I think it's very important when we, in his 50th anniversary of the theory of justice, for us, I like to say there's another paper that I read that says the house that Jack built And we would not be talking, I think, about Rawls still today if we're not thinking that this house really has egalitarian and social justice concerns. And it's a complicated house. It has many doors and many drawers, and these clarifications and all of these problems, I'm pretty sure that our graduate students can find in Paula's work and other researchers, inspiration for us to do these readings in an autonomous way. So thank you so much, Paula.
Rawls is too great to let other people claim it. No, we need to claim it for ourselves, and so how much is there that supports our social goals. No, so yeah.
Thank you, Paula. I'm very grateful that Julia had the idea of making this invitation. Now we could download your papers and get to know better your work. So we are very grateful for your wonderful contribution to this symposium. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to you. It's been a terrific conference. Thanks a lot. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
I'll be the last one to leave, no? Or do I have to leave because you have to go and do something else?
Okay. No, I think Cristina will give some announcements in Portuguese, I think. Okay. So if you wanna leave,
I know, I don't have to leave then. Okay, I can stay. Okay.
Right.
I can speak in English. We will have a short break, and we will return in 40 minutes for the next panels. So thank you again, Paula, and bye.
Bye.